Urena Beth never imagined that accepting a research position would cost her everything she believed about human nature. Within 72 hours, she would witness the most terrifying transformation of her life, and it wouldn't be happening to strangers. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine campus of the Millbrook Research Institute as Urena pulled into the parking lot, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. At 28, she had finally landed her dream job as a behavioral psychologist. But something about Dr. Harrison's phone call 3 days earlier had left her unsettled. "We need someone with your specific expertise in group dynamics," he had said, his voice carrying an urgency that made her stomach clench. "The project starts immediately. Pack for a week." Urena stepped out of her silver Honda, adjusting her blazer and smoothing down her shoulder-length auburn hair. She had always been the type of person who noticed details others missed, the way people's voices changed when they lied, how their posture shifted when they felt threatened. It was both her greatest strength as a psychologist and her deepest curse in personal relationships. Her ex-fiancé Mark had called it paranoia, but Urena knew better. She simply saw people for who they really were beneath their carefully constructed masks. The Institute building loomed before her, all glass and steel, reflecting the morning light like a mirror. As she approached the entrance, she noticed the unusual number of security cameras positioned at every corner, their black lenses following her movement with mechanical precision. A chill ran down her spine despite the warm September air. Dr. Harrison met her in the sterile lobby, his salt and pepper hair immaculately styled and his smile not quite reaching his pale blue eyes. "Urena, welcome. I trust your drive went well." His handshake was firm but brief, and she caught the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to his white lab coat. "Thank you for the opportunity, Dr. Harrison. I'm excited to begin." The words felt hollow in her mouth, but she maintained her professional composure. Something about his demeanor reminded her of her childhood therapist, too controlled, too measured, like he was constantly analyzing every interaction. "Excellent. Let me show you to your quarters first, then we'll begin orientation." He led her through a maze of corridors lined with frosted glass offices, their occupants visible only as shadowy silhouettes moving behind the barriers. The building felt more like a high-security facility than a research institute, with keycard access points at every turn and the constant hum of ventilation systems that seemed to whisper secrets through the walls. Her assigned room was spartanly furnished, a narrow bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto an interior courtyard surrounded by more glass walls. No outside view, no connection to the world beyond these sterile boundaries. Urena set down her suitcase and felt the weight of isolation settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. "The other participants will be arriving throughout the day," Dr. Harrison explained, checking his expensive watch. 12 individuals total, including yourself, all carefully selected for specific personality profiles and professional backgrounds. His choice of the word participants rather than colleagues sent another wave of unease through her chest. "What exactly is the nature of this research project?" Urena asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your initial description was rather vague." Dr. Harrison's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Social dynamics under controlled conditions. How ordinary people respond when their normal societal structures are temporarily suspended. Think of it as an extended version of classic psychological experiments, but with modern methodology and ethical oversight." The mention of classic experiments made Urina's blood run cold. She knew her psychology history, Stanford Prison, Milgram's obedience studies, the countless unethical trials that had shaped modern research protocols. "Are you referring to Zimbardo's work?" "Among others, yes. But I assure you, this study has been thoroughly vetted by our ethics committee. Every participant signed comprehensive consent forms." His tone had shifted, becoming more defensive, and Urina noticed how his left eye twitched almost imperceptibly when he spoke about ethics. Over the next few hours, she watched as 11 other people arrived at the Institute. There was Marcus, a former military officer with steel-gray eyes and ramrod-straight posture. Sarah, a soft-spoken elementary school teacher who kept nervously adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. David, a corporate lawyer whose expensive suit couldn't hide the tension in his jaw. Each person seemed normal, decent, the kind of individuals you might encounter at a coffee shop or grocery store without a second thought. But as the day wore on, Urina began to notice subtle changes in the group dynamics. During their introductory meeting in the main conference room, she observed how people unconsciously positioned themselves, some gravitating towards seats near the exits, others claiming spots that gave them clear views of everyone else. The natural human tendency to establish hierarchies and alliances was already beginning, even before the actual experiment commenced. Dr. Harrison addressed the group as evening approached, his presentation outlining what he called a social simulation designed to study leadership emergence and group cohesion under mild stress conditions. The 12 participants would be divided into 2 groups and given various tasks to complete over the course of 6 days. Simple enough, Urina thought, until she noticed the small print on the consent forms they were asked to sign again. Complete isolation from outside contact during the study period. She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why is that necessary for studying leadership dynamics?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and for just a moment, Dr. Harrison's mask slipped. In that instant, Urina saw something that made her stomach drop, not the face of an ethical researcher, but something much darker. Something that reminded her of the predators she had studied in her graduate work. But before she could process the full implications of what she had glimpsed, the lights in the conference room dimmed, and Dr. Harrison's voice took on an ominous tone that would haunt her dreams. "The experiment begins now." By the second morning, Urina realized that Dr. Harrison's definition of mild stress conditions bore no resemblance to reality. What began as a simple division into 2 groups had already begun tearing at the fabric of basic human decency, and they were only 36 hours in. She woke to the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights automatically illuminating her windowless room at exactly 6 a.m. No gentle sunrise, no gradual awakening, just the violent assault of artificial brightness that seemed designed to disorient rather than energize. Her internal clock felt completely scrambled, a sensation that reminded her of the sensory deprivation studies she had read about in graduate school. Studies that were now considered psychological torture. The common area buzzed with nervous energy as the 12 participants gathered for breakfast. Dr. Harrison had divided them into what he called Team Alpha and Team Beta. Though Urena noticed he never explained the criteria for selection. She found herself assigned to Alpha along with Marcus, the ex-military officer, 3 others she barely knew, and surprisingly, David, the corporate lawyer who had immediately begun positioning himself as their unofficial leader. Team Beta sat at the opposite end of the cafeteria, their table positioned so that both groups remained in constant visual contact with each other. Sarah, the elementary teacher, kept glancing over at Urena with an expression that seemed to plead for some kind of reassurance. But the invisible barrier between the teams felt as solid as bulletproof glass. "First task is simple," Dr. Harrison announced, his voice echoing through the sterile dining hall. "Each team will be given identical resources and 48 hours to construct the most effective shelter in the outdoor simulation area. The winning team receives enhanced accommodations and meal privileges for the remainder of the study." Urena felt her stomach clench at the word privileges. In psychological experiments, creating artificial scarcity was a classic method for triggering competitive behavior, but she had never expected to experience it firsthand. The implication was clear: the losing team would face deliberately worsened conditions. What happens to the team that doesn't win? Marcus asked, his military training evident in the direct, no-nonsense tone of his question. Dr. Harrison's smile never wavered, but his eyes gleamed with something that made Urena's skin crawl. "They learn valuable lessons about the consequences of ineffective leadership and poor resource allocation." The outdoor simulation area turned out to be a fenced compound behind the main building, complete with surveillance towers and guards positioned at regular intervals. Urena tried to tell herself they were there for safety purposes, but the way their eyes tracked every movement suggested something far more sinister. The space felt less like a research environment and more like a prison yard designed for maximum psychological pressure. Team Alpha's assigned section contained basic materials, tarps, rope, wooden planks, and basic tools. Nothing fancy, but enough to create functional shelter if they worked together efficiently. Under normal circumstances, Urena would have approached the task as an interesting team-building exercise. But these were far from normal circumstances. David immediately assumed command, his corporate background translating naturally into delegation and strategic planning. "Marcus, you handle the structural engineering. Your military experience gives you the best understanding of functional design. Urena, I want you observing Team Beta and reporting back on their strategies." The request hit her like a physical blow. "You want me to spy on them?" "I want you to use your psychological training to give us a competitive advantage," David corrected, but his tone carried an edge that hadn't been there the day before. "This is a competition, and we're going to win." Looking across at Team Beta, Urena watched Sarah struggling to drive stakes into the hard ground, her face flushed with exertion and frustration. 2 days ago, she would have walked over and offered assistance without a second thought. Now, an invisible wall of artificial tribalism prevented even basic human kindness. As the hours passed, she witnessed the gradual erosion of normal social boundaries. Marcus barked orders with increasing authority, his military background reasserting itself in ways that bordered on aggressive. David's corporate politeness gave way to calculated manipulation, and she noticed how he had begun positioning himself to take credit for successful innovations, while deflecting blame for setbacks onto other team members. But the most disturbing transformation was happening to herself. Despite recognizing the psychological manipulation at work, Urena found herself genuinely invested in defeating Team Beta. When she spotted Sarah's team making a critical structural error in their shelter design, her first instinct wasn't to help but to feel satisfaction at their potential failure. The realization made her physically nauseous. By evening, both teams had erected basic shelters, but the atmosphere in the compound had shifted dramatically. Where 24 hours earlier there had been polite strangers making small talk, now there were two distinct factions eyeing each other with barely concealed suspicion and hostility. During the communal dinner, Dr. Harrison circulated between tables with the calculated precision of a chess master analyzing his pieces. He made seemingly casual comments designed to heighten tensions, mentioning to Team Alpha how Team Beta had been speaking quietly during their construction work, then informing Team Beta that Team Alpha had been watching them quite intently throughout the day. Classic divide-and-conquer methodology, Urena muttered under her breath, but loud enough for Marcus to hear. What was that? His voice carried a sharpness that would have been unthinkable during their first meeting. Nothing. Just thinking out loud. She forced herself to smile, but internally she was screaming. The experiment was working exactly as designed, turning decent people into paranoid competitors willing to sacrifice basic humanity for artificial rewards. That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the constant hum of surveillance equipment, Urena realized that Dr. Harrison hadn't just divided them into teams. He had begun the systematic dismantling of their moral foundations, replacing empathy with tribalism and cooperation with competition. And they were only on day 2. The worst part wasn't what was happening to the others. The worst part was recognizing how easily she was falling into the same patterns, how her professional training couldn't protect her from the same psychological manipulation she had studied for years. She was becoming exactly what she had always feared, another test subject, whose humanity was slowly being stripped away in the name of scientific inquiry. As sleep finally claimed her, Urena's last conscious thought was a terrifying question. If this much change could happen in just 2 days, what would they all become by the end of 6? On the 4th day, Urena Beth discovered that the human capacity for cruelty could expand far beyond anything she had imagined possible in her worst academic nightmares. What she witnessed that morning would forever shatter her faith in the fundamental goodness of ordinary people. She woke to screaming. Not the controlled sounds of a staged emergency drill, but raw, primal cries of genuine terror that cut through the sterile walls of the institute like a blade through flesh. Urena bolted upright in her narrow bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as the sounds continued, desperate, pleading, utterly human in their desperation. The hallway outside her room buzzed with activity as other participants emerged from their quarters, faces pale and confused in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Marcus appeared first, his military bearing intact, but his eyes carrying a wildness that hadn't been there 3 days earlier. David followed, his expensive clothing now rumpled and stained, his corporate polish replaced by something hungrier and more primitive. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, her elementary teacher's instincts still intact despite everything they had endured. She was the only member of Team Beta that Urena could see, and the isolation in her expression was heartbreaking. Dr. Harrison emerged from a side corridor, his white lab coat pristine as always, but his smile wider than before. "Minor disciplinary issue with one of our participants. Nothing to concern yourselves with." His tone carried the same casual dismissal he might use to describe a malfunctioning piece of equipment. But Urena recognized the voice in those screams. It belonged to Michael, a quiet accountant from Team Beta, who had made the mistake of questioning the increasingly harsh conditions they were being subjected to. Yesterday, he had openly wondered aloud whether they were legally required to continue participating in the study. This morning he was somewhere beyond those walls, experiencing something that had reduced him to animal sounds of pure terror. "Where is he?" Urena demanded, her psychological training warring with a growing sense of moral obligation. "What are you doing to Michael?" Dr. Harrison's pale eyes fixed on her with predatory focus. Mr. Michael chose to violate the terms of his participation agreement. Actions have consequences, Dr. Beth. Surely someone with your educational background understands the importance of maintaining experimental integrity. The casual use of Michael's S-name alongside the clinical description of his punishment sent ice through Urena's veins. This wasn't research anymore, it was something far darker, something that belonged in the historical accounts of psychological torture she had studied but never imagined she would witness firsthand. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that somehow felt even more ominous. For the rest of the day, Michael was conspicuously absent from all group activities. When Team Beta asked about their missing member, Dr. Harrison simply stated that he had withdrawn from the study due to personal circumstances. But the fear in Sarah's eyes told a different story. She knew, just as they all knew, that Michael hadn't left voluntarily. The shelter competition concluded that afternoon with Team Alpha declared the winner by the narrowest of margins. Their reward was upgraded sleeping quarters in a different section of the building, complete with private bathrooms and marginally better meal provisions. Team Beta was relocated to what Dr. Harrison euphemistically called alternative accommodations, a basement area with concrete floors, communal restrooms, and lighting that seemed deliberately designed to create maximum psychological discomfort. Urena should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt nauseated watching Sarah and the other Team Beta members being led away like prisoners to their downgraded quarters. The arbitrary nature of their suffering was almost worse than the suffering itself. They were being punished not for any moral failing, but simply for losing a meaningless construction challenge. "Don't look so guilty," David whispered to her as they settled into their improved rooms. They knew the stakes when they signed up. "We played the game better, and we deserve the rewards." His words hit her like a physical blow. 3 days ago, David had been a polite corporate liar making small talk about his daughter's soccer games. Now he was rationalizing the deliberate psychological torture of people he had shared meals with, people who had committed no crime beyond losing an arbitrary competition. That evening, during what Dr. Harrison called reflection time, Urena found herself alone with Marcus in their upgraded common area. The ex-military officer sat rigidly upright on the marginally more comfortable furniture, his steel-gray eyes staring at something she couldn't see. "This isn't right," she said quietly, testing the waters of his conscience. Marcus turned to look at her, and what she saw in his expression made her stomach drop. "Right and wrong are luxury concepts, Urena. In survival situations, there's only winning and losing, only strong and weak." His voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had completely surrendered to the logic of the experiment. These aren't survival situations. This is artificial scarcity created to manipulate our behavior. Is it? Marcus asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than argumentative. "Because from where I'm sitting, the people in the basement are experiencing real discomfort while we're experiencing real comfort. The consequences feel pretty authentic to me." The casual way he dismissed the suffering of Team Beta members, people he had laughed with just days earlier, revealed the complete transformation of his moral framework. He wasn't pretending not to care. He genuinely no longer saw them as deserving of basic human consideration. Later that night, Urena lay in her upgraded bed listening to the sounds filtering up from the basement level. Muffled conversations, occasional crying, the restless movement of people trying to find comfort on concrete floors. Every sound felt like an indictment of her complicity in their suffering. She had won. Her team had secured better conditions through strategic thinking and effective cooperation. By every measure Dr. Harrison had established, she was succeeding in the experiment. But success felt indistinguishable from moral failure, and she realized that this had been the true purpose of the study all along. Dr. Harrison wasn't just observing how ordinary people responded to artificial hierarchy and scarcity. He was demonstrating how quickly civilized individuals could be transformed into willing participants in systematic cruelty, how easily they could learn to rationalize the suffering of others as necessary and deserved. And the most terrifying revelation was how completely it was working, not just on the others, but on herself. By day 6, Urena Beth had become everything she had once studied and feared, a willing participant in systematic psychological cruelty, and the realization would haunt her for the rest of her life. The transformation had been so gradual, so carefully orchestrated, that she barely recognized the person staring back at her in the bathroom mirror that final morning. Her auburn hair hung limp and unwashed, Her eyes carried a hollowness that spoke of compromised principles, and her hands that had once offered comfort to therapy patients, now trembled with the knowledge of what she had become capable of. The previous night had marked the complete breakdown of any pretense of ethical research. Dr. Harrison had introduced what he called resource allocation decisions, giving Team Alpha the power to determine Team Beta's daily food rations, sleeping schedules, and access to basic amenities. It was no longer enough to simply benefit from their elevated status. They were now required to actively participate in the TILA, systematic deprivation of other human beings. Urena had voted to reduce Team Beta's meal portions by 30%. The memory of raising her hand in that sterile conference room, of watching Sarah's face crumple with hunger and despair through the security monitors, made bile rise in her throat. But what terrified her most wasn't the action itself. It was how easily she had justified it at the time. They need to understand consequences, she had told herself. This will motivate them to perform better in future challenges. The language of rationalization had become as natural as breathing. Marcus had been even more direct in his cruelty, advocating for complete elimination of their recreational privileges and mandatory physical exercise at 5 a.m. as character-building measures. David had suggested psychological pressure tactics, including deliberate social isolation and public criticism sessions designed to break down individual resistance. They had become architects of suffering, and they had convinced themselves it was necessary. That final morning, as Urena forced herself to walk through the cafeteria where Team Beta sat hunched over their meager breakfast portions, she caught sight of Sarah attempting to share her reduced serving with another Team Beta member who looked ready to collapse from hunger. The elementary teacher's instinctive kindness, preserved even under these conditions, struck Urena like a lightning bolt of shame. Here was someone who had maintained her humanity despite 6 days of systematic psychological abuse, while Urena, the trained psychologist who should have recognized the manipulation, had surrendered her moral compass without even realizing it was happening. Second thoughts? Dr. Harrison appeared beside her with that predatory smile she had come to dread. It's natural to feel conflicted when witnessing the consequences of effective leadership decisions. His words were carefully chosen poison, designed to reframe cruelty as strength and basic human empathy as weakness. But for the first time in days, Urena heard them for what they truly were, the manipulative rhetoric of someone who had turned human suffering into entertainment. "This isn't leadership," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is systematic abuse disguised as research." Dr. Harrison's smile widened. "And yet you participated willingly. You voted to reduce their rations. You advocated for their continued punishment. Tell me, Dr. Beth, what does that make you?" The question hung in the air like a noose, and Urena realized with crystal clarity that this had been the true purpose of the experiment from the beginning. Not to study group dynamics or leadership emergence, but to document how quickly ordinary people could be transformed into willing perpetrators of cruelty. They weren't research subjects, they were case studies in the banality of evil. She looked around the cafeteria at her fellow Team Alpha members, noting their casual indifference to the suffering they had helped create. Marcus checked his watch with military precision, completely unbothered by the sight of people he had once shared jokes with now struggling to maintain basic dignity. David scrolled through notes on a tablet, probably planning new methods of psychological pressure for the day's activities. They had all become monsters, and the most horrifying part was how natural it felt. But as Urena watched Sarah continue sharing her limited food despite her own obvious hunger, she realized that transformation wasn't inevitable. Some people maintained their humanity even under the worst conditions, while others surrendered it at the first opportunity for advantage. The experiment hadn't revealed universal truths about human nature. It had revealed individual choices about who they wanted to be when their comfortable moral frameworks were stripped away. The final task of Day 6 was presented as a leadership evaluation exercise. Team Alpha would conduct individual interviews with each Team Beta member, assessing their performance and making recommendations for their continued participation in the study. The implication was clear. They now held the power to determine who would face further punishment and who might receive marginal relief from their suffering. Sitting across from Sarah in the interview room, Urena felt the full weight of what she had become. The elementary teacher's face was gone from reduced rations. Her wire-rimmed glasses couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. But she maintained a dignity that made Urena's stomach clench with shame. "I know what you're expecting me to say." Sarah spoke first, her voice steady despite her physical condition. "You want me to beg for mercy, to blame my teammates for our failures, to give you reasons to justify what you've done to us." Urena opened her mouth to deliver the prepared questions, but found she couldn't speak. "But I won't do that," Sarah continued, "because unlike you, I remember who I was before I walked through those doors. I remember that the person sitting across from me used to be someone who helped people instead of hurting them." The words hit like physical blows, stripping away every rationalization Urena had constructed over the past 6 days. She wasn't a leader making tough decisions or a researcher participating in important work. She was simply someone who had chosen cruelty over compassion when given the opportunity, someone who had traded her humanity for the temporary comfort of being on the winning side. The experiment was ending, but the real horror was just beginning, living with the knowledge of what she had become when she thought no one was watching. As Dr. Harrison's voice echoed through the building announcing the conclusion of the study, Urena realized that some transformations couldn't be undone. Some monsters, once awakened, never fully went back to sleep. The question that would haunt her forever wasn't how ordinary people could become evil. It was how easily she had discovered the evil that had always been lurking within herself, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. This story reveals the terrifying truth about what you might become under pressure. Subscribe now for more psychological thrillers that expose human nature's darkest secrets. Share this if it made you question your own morality. Comment, would you have become the monster? The answer might horrify you.